Hello and welcome to the Mac Gamecast, episode 51. With me today, co-hosting is the lovely Ted.
Hi.
How are you doing?
Doing good.
Nice. And guest starring today, we have Andrew.
Hi there, everyone. Glad to be on the show. Thank you.
Nice. So, for those of you listening who don't know, Andrew runs a YouTube channel of his name, Andrew Tsai. Does a lot of Mac game-related content. Will you tell us a little bit about that before we get into things?
Yes, I've been running a YouTube channel which mostly consists of kind of Apple Silicon Mac gaming news and tutorials. So I've been running that for multiple years. And I guess my main interest is getting games working on a Mac in general. So whether it's Windows games or running through something like Crossover through Wine or virtualizing it, or even running it through Linux, through something like Asahi Linux. I'm really just very interested in getting all types of games running on a Mac. So that's my main area of interest.
Very nice. And following on from that, last time we were on the show, we talked about all of the games coming to the Mac that were announced either at WWDC or right around that time. So I was thinking that we were going to talk more about the foundational technologies that were released at WWDC that will allow games to run not necessarily natively on the Mac, but will allow us to run them through other means, like you just said, through Crossover and such. Because Apple did announce quite a few things that are going to have quite the impact in that space. I know you've been looking into the Game Porting Toolkit version 2 that was released. So, like, how do you feel about that so far, having done some tests?
So if anyone hasn't seen my videos, I've been doing a lot of testing on Apple's new version of Game Porting Toolkit, which is basically their Windows translation layer, which is supposed to be used for developers to evaluate how much work is going to be required to port their Windows game over to macOS. And at WWDC, we had some new developments. We had the introduction of Game Porting Toolkit version 2, and that has some improved features. For example, the improved support for games which require AVX support, and also support for things like ray tracing. And it's a very exciting tool because it allows a much larger breadth of Windows games to be run through this translation layer on the Mac. And especially games which require AVX support, those are basically consist of a large number of very modern games which are now playable locally on Mac hardware. So that's a very exciting technology. We also have ray tracing as well, which is very interesting because the M3 Macs supports hardware ray tracing, but basically no games support hardware ray tracing on native macOS, but for the first time we've got Windows games which can use ray tracing, and they're running first through this translation layer, which makes it a very interesting tool. So I'm very excited about Game Porting Toolkit 2 in general.
Yeah, definitely. Like last time on the show, we also talked a bit about how, there aren't that many games on the Mac making use of ray tracing, even though the hardware's been there for a while. And John did mention that there's been like a few very low-profile titles that have used ray tracing natively on the Mac, but it's not really been something that we've seen a big AAA game or anything like that with on the Mac. I speculate that we're probably going to see it in Assassin's Creed Shadows when that comes to the Mac as a big title.
I mean, Ted, which titles do use ray tracing on a Mac? Because I'm not aware of them yet.
I haven't used anything.
I see. Okay,
yeah. I just got into Apple Silicon myself, just to let you know. So I've been doing boot camp before that, or currently, I should say.
Yeah, I think boot camp was a huge loss for Mac gamers. So boot camp gives you the ability to run Windows natively, and we lost that with the transition to Apple Silicon. There's no Windows 11 ARM that can be run natively, so we do have a lack of compatibility in general, which is why we're using all these other tools to try and get this all the games we used to be able to run working on a Mac. So, ray tracing is an interesting feature. I don't find it very important because ray tracing is such a huge resource hog. And it's such a marginal improvement in graphical quality. It's almost never worth turning on. But as a concept, it's interesting. I wonder if their future optimizations will make it more worthwhile on the Mac side. Maybe if there's a properly natively ported Mac game that makes use of ray tracing, that might be an interesting prospect. But, we haven't seen that yet, even though ray tracing Macs have been around for, I think, over 9 months now. So
something like that, I think,
Yeah.
But I mean, if anything, it's got to put that M4 Ultra whenever that comes out to some good use, right? Otherwise, what's the point of that machine? Yeah.
I look forward to testing it one day.
Oh, definitely. That's going to be super cool. But yeah, I was thinking about like something I noticed that I thought was very interesting about Game Porting Toolkit 2 was when Apple released the original Game Porting Toolkit, when you downloaded the package from Apple, what you got was like a TXT README file that was like, run these commands, put this here. You've basically got a wine setup. In Game Porting Toolkit 2, they directly refer you to an installation of Whiskey or Crossover, or there's one other one they mentioned that I forgot what it was, and guide you through installing through that and like replacing the version that's in those libraries with the Game Porting Toolkit 2 one. And also they have like way more refined documentation for actually taking something that is running through Game Porting Toolkit and making the final adjustments to make it a native game. It feels like a generally more refined process, and also endorsing these tools that have been there for a while, working with them instead of trying to, I don't know, replace them or whatever it felt like the original one was doing.
Yeah.
I think it shows some interest in the community of Mac gaming and what we're all about that I like to see from Apple, and that I think is a positive direction that shows some engagement from their side.
Yeah, I think it's certainly positive that they acknowledge, in the developer conference, in one of the videos, they talk about Crossover, and they talk about Whiskey, which is, a wine environment which is free and which is all community based. So it's interesting that there's an acknowledgement and that they are kind of releasing things and working together with these community tools. So that's a very interesting step, and it's also quite exciting that there is a change in the language around the use of Game Porting Toolkit, that it's not just about evaluating and developing ports, it's also about running the games in the first place. And I'm really interested in where that might go exactly. It's really hard to say what it means, but there is some kind of fundamental change happening. I just don't know what it is going to lead to, because the natural conclusion to working with a community, a large corporate entity like Apple, working with the community to develop tools to run these Windows games on a Mac without an official port, all that path. If you keep following that route, what it means is Proton for Mac. It means what Valve have done, and why don't we just release fixes for every single Windows game and get it all working on a Mac, and we don't need ports anymore. And I don't really see Apple doing that. No. Right? It feels like there's an undercurrent, another branch which is kind of doing that, but without the oversight of a large corporate entity like the top. So it's a bit confusing, to be honest. I don't really understand what they're doing.
I can definitely see that and agree with that. But as I said, with the Game Porting Toolkit 2 bundle that you download from Apple, there is also like very developer-oriented documentation in there, like human interface guidelines for the porting your game to Mac. There's sample code for how to take something that's initially a Windows game and put in cloud saves across Apple platforms, so you can, save on a phone and continue on a Mac. And so I definitely think that Apple's direction here is still aimed at trying to get more native ports, but that, they also further support translation layers as some kind of way of driving engagement or something. I mean,
I've always thought that it just doesn't really make sense, because increasing, the level of compatibility for general Windows games, it doesn't really do much for developers, because a developer, you have access to the source code of your own game. You can make whatever changes you want to comply with whatever Apple's developer guidelines are. You don't need a translation layer to get your game working on a Mac. You can just code it to make it work. It's not. It requires resources. It's not really that complicated to do. And so the translation layer, I don't feel like it helps porting, right? What it does is it helps enthusiasts like us get these Windows games working on a Mac. It doesn't really. So it's a confusing strategy, unless there's some deeper strategy which I'm not really aware of.
I mean, if I were to guess, I would say it's because Apple has seen that there is this sort of chicken and egg thing where developers go, but there's no games. There are people wanting to play games on the Mac, and the people who want to play games on the Mac go, well, there's no games, so how can we show that we want to play games? So they thought, well, if we show that there is a demand, and then also, these studios can go, oh, my game can actually run decently even through all these translation layers. I guess there is a reason to do it. I think that's what they're aiming for, at least. I'm not sure how well it works, but I think that's what they were trying to do with this. And then, of course, there's something to be said about the fact that, the fewer components you need to replace all at once to get your game running at all, the faster you can iterate on that, right? If you only need to make the audio subsystem native, and then you have native audio, but you're still running through D3D Metal or whatever, then you can still see that's working and then move on to the next bit.
I mean, the thing about D3D Metal is that it's a closed source component, and it's not licensed to ship with a game. So you can't just wrap like in the past you had Mac ports which were wrapped in Wine, and you would sell it with Wine, and it was a Windows game in a Mac shell. But this D3D Metal, which Apple have developed, works great as a translation there, but you can't under the license that they distribute it, you can't sell it, right? Mm-hmm. You can't sell it with it bundled. So I don't really understand how it makes a shortcut, because there are parts of the game porting toolkit which are shortcuts, like the Metal Shader Converter will change your shaders into Apple proprietary graphic shaders. So that's going to work, right? But the translation layer it's a mystery to me what it means, because like I said, the end conclusion is you have a translation layer where you can play. If Apple's goal is to expand the gamer player base, right? I'm not sure how they're going to do it in large enough numbers. Like, let's say they attract millions of new gamers, right? And the only way is it will be a very un-Apple thing to do, to say, okay, well, here's a translation layer. You're going to need community fixes to get past the little launcher window screen here. You're going to have to insert. You're going to have to use. This error message is because of a compatibility layer error. It's very un-Apple. Apple is, what they want is you click the button, the game loads up, but that's it, right? They don't want you to experience any kind of inconvenience or difficulty. And I don't really see how the translation layer is going to get there unless there is like a huge amount of community support involved. Like on the Steam Deck side with Valve, there is a huge open source community working on that. The main graphics API is Vulkan, which is open source, right? There are millions of people working on this. If you have an issue with a game, then somebody will fix it, and then Valve will eventually incorporate it into Proton and ship it basically, and then they'll put a stamp on it and say Steam Deck ready. It's ready for the Steam Deck. That this is going to work. And I just don't see Apple doing anything like that in large enough numbers to be able to mean anything. Like, I remember Mr. MacWright telling me that the total number of like crossover users, people who use crossover to run Windows games on a Mac, is like very small, like in the tens of thousands or something. I can't confirm that number, but it's in the grand scheme of like the gaming market, which is made up of millions and millions of gamers, it's a tiny, infinitesimally small market of actual people going through the work involved. And it might be possible to do with a little bit of work. I love tinkering, but most people are not going to accept any level of tinkering to get their game running on a Mac.
Yeah. Sorry, Ted?
No, I was just going to say I'm one of those guys who likes the minimum amount of tinkering, especially when, if I have my Mac and that's the one I use to do things with, I don't want to start. It took me a long time to get into Boot Camp because I originally had a Mac, a Mac Pro, and back when they had the Fusion drive. And before they fixed the problem with Boot Camp, I tried to put Boot Camp on it and completely destroyed the Fusion drive. And I had to go to an Apple's expert to get it repaired. And then a few months later, there was a change to Boot Camp drivers to get the partition to work on a Fusion drive. But by then, I was too scared to do it again. So, but that's, I have a little bit of comfortability with futzing around with, the terminal and stuff like that, but not a lot. And I think, it would be easier for me, honestly, to look at getting a PC to go along with my system to play some of the games. And that's why Boot Camp was a great solution when I got it to work on the iMac 27-inch. So, just a comment,
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a huge loss that Boot Camp went away with the Apple Silicon transition. But on the one hand, it's a huge loss because it was significantly easier once it was set up to get things going. You didn't have to tinker as much once you were in a Windows environment. But on the other hand, I feel like the loss of Boot Camp and the Apple Silicon transition brought a lot of developer interest in getting games running on macOS without needing to boot into Windows. And we might still be running through translation layers, but there's so many games that are playable that way now that weren't playable back in the Intel days, that still aren't playable if you're on an Intel Mac, even though some of them run through x86 translation, which is a bit funny. So in some sense, that's also reduced the tinkering level because you don't need to set up a Windows environment as a dual boot, but you're then tinkering in a different way within macOS. So I don't know if that's a win or an overall loss.
Yeah, I mean, Boot Camp is simple, but it's like Ted said, you could completely destroy your Mac environment by accident, right?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people have done that. So it's not a simple, easy thing, right, to do. Because once you get into the Windows installer and it says, format drive, what does that mean exactly? What have you done?
Yeah. Right? Which one should I pick? Do I pick the wrong one? Do I wipe my system? All that.
A lot of people pick the wrong thing. Yeah. And you're right. There are a few that, in a way, there's fewer things to mess up if we run through a translation layer. And of course, with Apple Silicon, even the base level chips have more powerful GPUs than the Intel Macs of the past. The base levels anyway. I remember in 2020 when they were still selling Intel MacBook Airs at the same time as Apple Silicon MacBook Airs. So they had they looked exactly the same, but they performed completely differently, especially with the graphics. Apple Silicon's way, way ahead because Intel's integrated graphics was so terrible and ran so hot. So yeah, it's definitely an improvement, and I wouldn't trade it. Even though I guess technically you could have bought a MacBook or a Mac Pro with a dedicated graphics card. I think the advantages of having a relatively cool, good battery life, let's say laptop, with the more powerful GPUs is I think it's a better trade-off. And yeah, like you said, has attracted a lot of developer interest as well.
Definitely. You mentioned before something about low number of users actually using crossover to play games and such. I read an article, I think earlier today actually, that said that the number of sold copies of these new AAA games that have been announced it was specifically about sales on phones and iPads, but it said that the Resident Evils and the Assassin's Creed Mirage and that sort of game, that they didn't really sell that well. They specifically said that they bombed. So I kind of fear if that's going to have an impact on the future of native gaming on the Mac as well. It was on the phone, and I could imagine some people being more inclined to play big games like that on Macs than phones. But if they sell equally poorly on the Mac, then are the developers going to keep putting porting effort onto the Mac? I don't know. It's a bit.
Yeah, I'm in the middle of a video. I just recorded this video on this and editing it now. But yeah, it is a worry because, of course, these big AAA games, they're featured on the Apple stage. And they're relatively high profile. And I think to a certain extent, Apple would have known beforehand that these wouldn't sell very well.
Yeah.
I just don't think people want to play Assassin's Creed on an iPhone. No. I just don't think it want to happen. It's quite funny because... Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, none of us want to, at least. Right?
Yeah, so. I'm not playing on a small screen.
Yeah, I mean, even an iPad is a stretch.
Yeah,
I think it's just I think that it's pretty obvious that this whole thing is just a PR move. It's just a tick box saying we can play AAA games. I don't think it's particularly important. I think if Apple were really trying to be clever about, let's say, their mobile gaming strategy, right? Really, the majority of revenue from gaming on a phone or in the Apple ecosystem, almost all the revenue comes from free-to-play games, right? Free-to-play titles. Call of Duty Mobile, PUBG, Genshin Impact, all these auto AFK games, these kind of gacha games, all of these games which rely on the in-game purchases, right? In-app purchases. Mm-hmm. They drive almost all the revenue on the gaming side, and no one really wants to buy AAA games in the Apple ecosystem. Multiple reasons. They don't perform very well. So Assassin's Creed Mirage barely gets 30 FPS, 25 FPS on, the most expensive smartphone and the most expensive iPad that you can buy. And games like Death Stranding, which I covered a lot, they don't perform well. And on the Mac side, I think that these games do work really well. Like Death Stranding is great on the Mac. Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil Village, they really take advantage of the hardware. But people are not really invested in this. They don't want to pay the relatively high price. They don't want to invest in the Apple ecosystem because they've got a console or they've bought it on Steam already. And almost all of these games are just way too late. So Assassin's Creed Mirage is like 7 or 8 months late compared to the first release on console and PC. Resident Evil 4 was about 9 months. Resident Evil Village was a year and a half or something like that. And we're going to get Resident Evil 7 next week. And that's like 5 years. There's like 7 years late or something, 2017. Oh. So it's just I can't imagine anyone getting excited about Resident Evil 7 coming out on their phone, right? But and also way too many Resident Evil games. They need to find a different genre. There's other games using the same engine, like Street Fighter 6 would be much better idea to port that game to iPhone, iPad, Mac. A lot more people want to play something like that. That'll be more interesting. But Apple, it's clearly just a PR stunt. This whole thing is just an idea to show off, yes, my phone can play these games, my Mac could play these games. And, Assassin's Creed Mirage is an annoying example because it's iPhone and iPad only, and it can clearly work on the Mac. In fact, right before this, we just started recording this podcast, I've got Assassin's Creed Mirage finally working on a Mac.
Right.
And it can be sideloaded using the mobile app, and it works way better than a phone. I don't understand why, if Apple got this relationship with Ubisoft, why they couldn't force them to release on Mac as well. I think the whole thing is just kind of a half-baked idea, having all these AAA titles released and almost kind of forgotten. Like I think for Apple and Ubisoft, they don't care about the sales numbers. They don't really care how many people are actually playing them. On Assassin's Creed Mirage, there was a suggestion that roughly only less than 3,000 people upgraded to the full version of the game, which is like pitiful compared to, what Assassin's Creed Mirage made on all consoles and PC and everything.
Yeah, everyone else just wanted to see, ooh, look, my phone can play it. Oh, I'm done. Put it away. But like on that point, I think Ubisoft might not care like with sales because Apple has probably already paid them a huge amount of money. I think Apple would care if it was selling super well, but I think you're right that they probably didn't anticipate it to sell super well and don't mind that it doesn't because they get the PR value. But I do think that it would make them look and focus on it if it did suddenly sell super well. But like as you say with Assassin's Creed Mirage being a weird omission on the Mac, it's especially interesting because at WWDC, one of the sessions, they were talking about how Assassin's Creed Shadows is such a good example of the ability to port to Apple as a platform and get your games across all Apple platforms and the huge market that is for developers. And then, you did that with Shadows, but what about Mirage? Why didn't you do it with that one? It's a weird omission. And performance would obviously be significantly improved on the Mac. So it is a bit bizarre.
It calls into question, like, what is the point of releasing a game in multiple platforms, including mobile? Right? Because it makes sense on paper, right? On paper, I think, well, iPhone is the most successful games console of all time, right? It makes more money than all the other game companies put together, right? But that doesn't really apply to AAA games. And, it's such a huge amount of work to get Death Stranding to work on a phone, right? And there's so many compromises involved. And no one's playing it. And so, there's a PR value, but it's also a misguided PR as well, because, who cares whether your phone can play a AAA game? What does it matter? What does it matter in the end? And why are they pursuing this strategy of getting every game working?
I kind of wonder if part of why these games aren't selling that well is just because it's exclusive to the highest end iPhone 15 Pro. And if it were available on the iPhone 15 and 14 Pro and maybe even 14, that maybe they would do better. I don't know, because again, neither of us and any of us want to play on the phone, but maybe it is a small market.
Even if it's supported, let's say the last 3 generations, let's say that it sold 10 times more, so let's say 30,000 people bought it. That's still tiny. That's still not enough. Even if it sold like 50 times more, it's still not enough, right, to justify the whatever costs were justify beyond the PR value, whatever this is.
That is true.
I don't know. Obviously, it would sell more if it ran well on other phones, but it barely runs on the 15 Pro. And I imagine Shadows will probably work okay on the iPhone 16 Pro, but it's hard to say. I have no idea. Again, I think that Shadows is going to be an interesting example because that's your first simultaneous AAA release on a phone, But are you going to buy it on a phone, or are you going to buy it on your Xbox or PS5 or your PC? You're going to pay top dollar to play it on an iPad? I don't know. Maybe if it was cheaper on an iPad than on mobile, then it might be more tempting, I think. I don't know.
Do any of you two know if it's been announced if Shadows is coming to Steam or if it's only on the Mac App Store?
Yeah, it's on Steam. Yeah.
Okay, that's at least
Steam. Good. Yeah, it'll be on Steam.
Then you're also in a situation where, from Apple's perspective, they might not even see the huge benefit of the sales that it might have on the Mac if people just buy it on Steam. They might have the PR value of the Mac can run it, but they might not get any revenue share of that, right? So yeah.
Oh yeah, they wouldn't. Yeah.
But speaking of oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, like a lot of people talk about revenue share, right? And I don't really think that Apple care that much about revenue share for games at this stage. Just from the evidence of like what games they promote on the stage, right? So one example is like No Man's Sky. We've been seeing No Man's Sky for a long time, but it's never been released on the Mac App Store. The iPad version is nowhere to be seen. It's been announced for years now. But they were happy to have them on stage. They're happy to promote games like World of Warcraft, put them on stage, but that's never been on the Mac App. There's no revenue share there.
Right.
Games like The Medium and Layers of Fear, the Bloober games, which were heavily featured in Game Porting Toolkit, they've just been removed from the Mac App Store 1 year after they were released, basically. So the Mac versions are only on Steam. So there must have been some kind of 1 year exclusivity contract, not exclusivity, but one year Mac App Store contract, which they just decided not to continue. And Apple have got all the money in the world, right? They can do whatever they want. They can offer whatever incentives that they want, but they just didn't do it. There's lots of things that they promote that don't go through the Mac App Store, is what I mean, right? And it's a strategy I don't understand either, right? But yeah,
right. Yeah, but that's a good point. But at the same time, they very recently patched one of the largest holes in the Mac App Store, as far as I am aware, in terms of making it a viable gaming platform. And they've removed the requirement to have more than twice the storage capacity of whatever size game you're installing. That's huge for like the Mac App Store's ability to be a game storefront. So that to me tells me that maybe they are putting some focus on making the Mac App Store more of a games platform. I don't know.
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah,
I think it's a small step. It's a small step in the general. It's a small and significant step, but it's not the main reason why people don't buy on the Mac App Store. Right?
Sure, there's many more issues with that platform.
Yeah.
For one thing, I would love the ability to install directly to an external SSD. That would also sort of circumvent this issue in the first place. But yeah. And yeah, there's just you already have a lot of games on Steam. That's a difficult thing to compete with.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
In terms of like the compatibility with games that have come out recently through all these translation layers, you mentioned before that AVX is now available. So we have a huge plethora of games that are now playable that didn't used to be. I've played around with the AVX support a bit from just a programming perspective. And something that I can't figure out if it's intentional or not, and it probably isn't because it's kind of a weird behavior, is that the CPU doesn't advertise the fact that it supports AVX now. If you run sysctl, or if you just do some programming way of asking it through CPU ID if it supports AVX, it says no. But if you try to run the AVX instructions, it works just fine. Like that's causing unnecessary issues with games that we're having to circumvent. Do you perceive that as being some sort of intentional block to make developers still try and port their games, but if they have the ability to force the AVX path, it still works? Or do you think that's a bug or what?
From what I understand, that's oversight. Yeah, it's like a bug that they're going to fix. There's a couple of Apple developers inside the Apple Gaming Wiki Discord, and that's basically what they said, that they intend to fix that in the future. So that's the reason why a lot of these AVX games complain about lack of AVX support. It's because the features aren't being exposed correctly. It's a beta product. macOS Sequoia, the new beta OS, doesn't come out for months. So hopefully it'll get fixed by then. It'll be integrated into Rosetta 2. Who knows? I don't know yet.
Yeah.
But I don't think they did it on purpose. I don't think it's a conspiracy to gimp the ability to run those games.
Yeah. I sort of had two reasons for thinking it might have been intentional. One being that, yeah, if you are the developer with the access, you can just force the AVX path, and so it's not aimed at us enthusiasts, it's aimed at developers. But the other reason was also that the performance of the AVX instruction set is quite poor relative to running something like Neon SimD or whatever natively. So I figured that maybe they were just not exposing it while it was not performing that well anyway. So if the game does have a fallback to general purpose registers, they just use that. But I don't know. It's good if it's not on purpose, at least.
I'm not aware of. I would be surprised if Apple were intentionally. Any developer was intentionally making their product perform worse. I know that Apple, historically, like Steve Jobs, would mandate that iTunes perform worse on Windows than on Mac. But other than, in these days, I'd be surprised because they're trying to. There is a strategy trying to get these things working better. Yeah. And AVX support also seems to have improved compatibility with other games. There's like Mafia 3, the Mac port works now on macOS Sequoia. I think there's some other games which I'm not aware of, which the Mac ports perform better or they're more compatible now because they got those features which were lost in the Intel transition. So, yeah.
And in sort of broad general strokes, how much improved would you say the general game compatibility is on Sequoia with the new Rosetta and Game Porting Toolkit 2 and all that, just from your experiences so far?
Well, it seems like a large number of, I'd say, AAA titles released in the last 5 years seem to check for the AVX requirement. Whether they actually needed them or not remains to be seen. But I think a lot of developers, when they create games, they just have development environments which check for these things. Sometimes they require them, sometimes they don't really require them, which is why a lot of games have AVX patches so that you can run those games on a Windows computer from like 10 years ago, 12 years ago. They might have the GPU power to run them, but they don't have that specific like SSE, they don't have AVX. So there's a lot of games with patches like that. So I would say there's a lot of games which people want to play, which are now compatible with Game Porting Toolkit 2 and macOS Sequoia. But the main issue, I'd say, is that people still can't play those games, those very popular multiplayer games, which require access to anti-cheat. So anything that runs easy anti-cheat, anything that runs BattleEye, anything like Call of Duty, Warzone, PUBG, these huge multiplayer games, Fortnite, you can't run them on a Mac even through these translation layers, even though they probably could work. Like you can load up Rainbow Six Shield, right? You can play around the menu, but you can never join a game, just because the anti-cheat is trying to prevent you from running through a compatibility layer for obvious reasons. They're trying to stop cheaters, and they could allow exceptions for the Mac platform in the same way that the Steam Deck has easy anti-cheat exceptions for games run through Proton, for example. Apex Legends can run on SteamOS through Linux, and it has an exception for easy anti-cheat, which built in, so Steam Deck users can play on it. But no such compatibility has been allowed for Mac users running through Crossover or running through Game Porting Toolkit 2. And I don't think that's ever going to happen because the numbers are just too small to justify it. I mean, today I just saw Steam Deck users, Steam Deck sales up about 2 million so far. So that's a decent amount, right? I mean, you might say, oh yeah, Macs have sold hundreds of millions since then, but the amount, you compare the active gaming player base, it's just not enough to justify those kind of games. So yes, AVX is a huge step in the right direction, but people really want to play multiplayer, current live service type games, and all of those live service games use anti-cheat to give their players a good gameplay experience without cheaters. And I think that they see Mac users running through translation layer as too much work. They don't want to support Mac at all. They don't want to compromise their code base just to allow a few thousand people to play that multiplayer game. And so that still remains, I think, the main issue overall. Like, people keep asking me, like, I want to play Ghost of Tsushima on the Mac, right? I mean, that's a big game, right? It'll be a huge win if you could play that on a Mac. But it's only has 33,000 concurrent users on Steam. You know, it's small, right? Compared to something like Call of Duty or Genshin Impact. I mean, Genshin Impact has got millions of people playing it concurrently. You know, it's just tiny compared to these live service money making games. So yes, yeah, that's my answer.
Right. With respect to something like the Steam Deck, where you say they have exceptions for things like easy anti-cheat, do you know if that's like something that's being exploited and abused by cheaters a lot, or if that just doesn't matter? Like, yeah.
I'm not really sure, but from what I understand is that if you have a multiplayer game, then you're constantly fighting a war against cheaters. And cheaters use lots of different ways to manipulate the game environment. So you can do things like have an aimbot to aim your gun, or deciding to not render parts of your screen so you can look through a wall. And so when you run a game through a compatibility layer, it's kind of the opposite of what you're trying to do. You want everyone to not be on a compatibility layer. You don't want anyone running on a virtual machine. You don't want anyone running through Wine, because if you're running through Wine, you're running through a software layer which is changing the way that your game looks. And then it becomes, I think, 10 times harder to detect whether someone's cheating through that, because you could change Wine to do something different on your screen, and then you'd have to verify everyone's Wine installations. I'm not a programmer, so I don't really understand how it works exactly. But you know, it's from what I understand is that the con of not supporting a Mac user is that, oh, we lose a few thousand players, right? But the con of allowing a pathway for cheaters to go in to your game is huge. If your multiplayer game, you know, if you go into a game of Apex Legends and you get sniped by a cheater on the other side of the map, and it happens 3 times in a row, then you'll never play that game again, right? You've lost customers forever, right? And I think Wine is like a huge translation layer is a huge part of that. Keeping the integrity of your game solid, and this cat and mouse between hackers and players. They probably have teams of dozens, hundreds of people fighting hackers all the time, right? Which is why they use anti-cheat software to verify your local game files, making sure that no one's changing anything, making sure that people aren't altering the packets between your computer and someone else's on the server. And I don't really understand, but I think that cheating is like anti-cheat anyway. It's like it's probably a multi-billion dollar business. And Mac gaming it's not a multi-billion dollar business. That's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I do know about the way anti-cheats work is that they often hook in to have a view of all of the memory of the game. And the way macOS's permission and security model work, that's just, you can't do that. Your binary needs to be signed as a debugger to even be allowed to trace through a program like that. And you can't just read the memory of another process. Windows will often have these anti-cheat measures running in kernel space, which means that they basically get arbitrary permission to look at any bit of hardware, and if they crash, then they could take down the whole system as well, something that Apple is not likely to allow either. Throughout the past couple of years, Apple has been reducing the ways in which you can hook into the kernel as well. So even if you are writing a driver for some bit of specialized hardware, they now want you to go through an API they call DriverKit that is more stable and doesn't give you full kernel level privileges. It just allows you to hook into the very specific parts that you need to write your driver, and then get out of kernel space. So yeah, the architecture of these existing anti-cheat measures is not directly compatible with the way macOS functions, or Linux for that matter, by
so
default.
I mean, that's the most detailed explanation I've ever heard. So do you think that anti-cheat is fundamentally incompatible with macOS?
I think the architecture of anti-cheat that exists prevalently in the wild right now is fundamentally incompatible, yes. I don't believe it's fundamentally incompatible to create some form of anti-cheat, especially if it's an anti-cheat that is either developed by, co-developed by, or directly inserted into the code base by the developer of the game. But if it's something that needs to run out of process, which a lot of the existing ones do, even though they don't necessarily need to, that wouldn't really fly, I think. But it's definitely possible to make it happen.
Yeah. It's possible, but it's just more work. I mean, all of these big games, they seem to be buying anti-cheat software off the shelf,
exactly.
Easy Anti-Cheat, BattleEye, and then let them maintain that war against cheaters, and then just integrate it into the game separately. So it seems like it's just not economic to support multiplayer gaming on a Mac.
Right. I do know that there is, I forget the name of the company, but there is a company out there that sells an anti-cheat software mechanism library. It's a code library that is Mac compatible. I forget what it's called, but it is out there. It's not that widely used, and there might be reasons for that. I don't know how good it is relative to the competition at keeping away cheaters and such, but it does exist in the market. But as long as the game studios prefer to use the ones that are incompatible, then, well, that doesn't really help much.
It just really comes down to numbers, because if there were like millions of Mac gamers, then they would figure out a solution to accommodate this issue, but there just aren't, right? So I think that's the main problem. Yeah, the chicken and egg problem.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so I do work professionally as a programmer, and one thing we often say when customers make demands, or, not our direct customers, but the people in our sales department, is, I mean, everything's possible. We can do it all. It's just a matter of resources and where we want to spend the time, right? And if something's used by 1% of the user base, but would take 90% of our resources for several months, then the numbers don't add up.
Happen, right?
Yeah. But generally, asking the room here, both Ted and Andrew, of course, what is your level of optimism for both the native future of Mac gaming and the opportunities for translation layers and the sort?
Do you want to go with Ted?
I don't really have an opinion on that. I think I have to agree with a lot what Andrew said about, that this is a big PR thing, and having been trying to be a Mac gamer, I mean, for a long time, going back before the games disappeared off the Mac. And we were talking in the 90s when, you could go to a Mac World and talk to the Bungie guys, and, they would have a game that was, made exactly for the Mac at the time. But I think the translation layer is, for the most part, is going to be it for a long time. I mean, I've actually played a couple of the games that, I was just playing No Man's Sky the other day. That I have it on Steam, but I'd already played it on the Boot Camp side, so I downloaded the Mac version. And frankly, it's not any better or any nicer on the Mac side, and it actually just felt a little bit clunkier than with playing it on my old Intel Mac versus my M3 Power MacBook Pro. I was kind of surprised. I actually thought it would look a lot more spectacular, especially when I ramped the graphics up to Ultra, which, but it looked a little fuzzy. I don't know if that was me, but whatever.
I mean, if I was running a Windows version and a Mac version on the same hardware, I'd actually expect the Windows version to be optimized better, right? If you're running on an Intel Mac.
Yeah,
Pro.
and it's amazing. I was kind of surprised about that. I think the translation layers is going to be the way to go for quite a long while, unless. The way I've said this before in other podcasts that we've done here, it's like the people who really want to play games on the Mac, for the most part, have already come up with an alternate solution. Right? There was the boot camp, and now a lot of them are, like my consideration once I heard about Apple Silicon was, okay, I'll get a PC and I'll have a Mac. The Mac is for my living life because of the security and the fact that the interface works so well and smoothly. I don't have to worry about things. But for gaming, it's easier for me just to stick with, where everything's optimized and the selection is wider.
Yeah.
But one of the reasons for getting the Silicon was because I wanted to see how much I could actually do with the translation layer. So I think that's, right now I'm in the experimentation stage, and so far I think the anti-cheat hit me first game I tried. And it said, nope, can't play. Anti-cheat won't let you go. And that was New World. Yeah. New World, which is an MMO, which I play a lot. I've put in over 1,000 hours on that game on Windows. So, I thought it would be cool to try it out. I play online with other people, so I could actually try the, integration of that. But nah, that didn't work. Hogwarts Legacy just flat out died. So, I mean, I might need some tweaking. I don't know. I have to play around a little bit. And I didn't put the version 2 of the Apple porting toolkit into crossover yet. I'm going it with the native, and I figure at some point I'm going to try to see if I can figure out how to do the moving the files. But, I'm sure there's somebody has a tutorial out there somewhere.
I mean, Ted, you've got your Windows boot camp set up on your Mac Pro, and you've got your M3 MacBook. Is that right?
Yeah, right.
You've got two computers. So do you ever find yourself with your MacBook and thinking, if you're out of the house or something, you want to play a game on it, or do you ever feel like you do? Yeah.
Yeah.
What would you play then?
Well, honestly, what I've done when I did do this, I used to have an Intel MacBook Pro too, but anyhow, I just got this one. But I actually use the what do you call it, the NVIDIA gaming thing. GeForce Now. I go on vacation, so I'll take a couple of weeks and we'll go somewhere, and I'll take my MacBook with me. So I'll buy a month of the GeForce Now with all the bells and whistles, which is like $20 or something like that, and all the games I'm currently playing are there. So all I have to do is, and I have all my setup done. I just basically play into it and play it on their machine with my computer just being the visual and audio interface, which works really well.
That's a really common setup, I think. Game streaming is going to be the solution for a lot of people, rather than trying to tinker too hard with crossover or trying to play a native Mac game. They're just going to, play using streaming. I mean, does New World work with GeForce Now?
Yes, it does. And I've actually played it on there, a couple times. And when I was on vacation with my old MacBook, the Intel, the 17 that I just replaced, and it played really nice on it. Good graphics, and the audio was fine, no lag. So
you couldn't play Boot Camp New World on your 2017 MacBook Pro?
I could have, but I don't. I have a 27-inch iMac, so I usually play it on that. I actually set it up to do that when I first got it, but then I ended up getting the 27-inch Intel iMac with it, which was a lot nicer. And I like the big screen. I have to face it. I really like having when I'm playing a game to have something in front of me that looks nice.
So you boot camp your iMac Pro. Is that what you?
It's just an iMac. It's just a regular 27-inch.
Yeah, 27. You put boot camp on it, and then
I have boot camp on it.
You roll through that.
Yeah, okay. And I have no problem going back and forth. I mean, you have to reboot, but I thought
it doesn't take long. Yeah,
no, it doesn't take that long, and it boots fast. And the games. The only thing is, I don't have a big partition, so I have all the games on an external SSD. But I get pretty good throughput, and I don't really wait too long to get the games started. So,
yeah, it's not bad. I mean, it doesn't really for Apple Silicon, right? It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how good your compatibility is. If it doesn't run your favorite MMO, then what's the point, right? That's the problem.
Right. Well, for since the beginning of World of Warcraft, I played that, and that was always cross-platform, which is one of the reasons why I got into it. I was actually part of the original stress test when the game first came out, and I played that for years, but finally just got a little tired of it, so that's why I started branching out. Mm-hmm. But that was good. Yeah.
The days of Blizzard releasing Mac ports is over, so it's a real shame. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about you, Andrew? Do you feel optimistic about the future, or?
Well, like I said, I don't think that Apple's AAA strategy makes any sense, and it's not gonna do anything meaningful, because if they release 3 or 4 AAA games per year, that's still a fraction of what it needs to be. It needs to be 10 times more, 30 times more, something like that.
Sure.
For it to be viable, right? Currently it's just not. And it kind of proves that, it doesn't matter how much money you have. Apple are the most cash-rich corporation in the world. They can't buy enough. You can't really buy games, right? You can't really do that. You can't. And so what it leaves us with is this compatibility layer strategy, which I'm also confused about. I don't really know what the end game is, and so no, I'm not optimistic. I'm still interested in it, because I think from a technical perspective, it's interesting to see what would happen if you paid developers to optimize their games on Mac. I think there are some big advantages to Apple Silicon, like the relatively low power requirements, the relatively powerful GPUs for the low wattage it uses. There's lots of things which would make, let's say, a game like Resident Evil 7, which comes out next week, could be better than on a gaming laptop. But it's very thin, right? It's very there's not a lot to it. I feel like it's not gonna. It's not enough to move the needle in the favor of making the Mac or making Apple Silicon mobile games like a viable thing, right? There needs to be like way more stuff happening, and there's just not enough, right? It's just one flagship thing every year. Every year is No Man's Sky or Resident Evil Village or Resident Evil 4 or Death Stranding, and now it's Assassin's Creed Shadows. We're talking about one game per year, right? 1 or 2 games per year.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm just like a hopelessly naive optimist or something. But after WWDC, I was sitting there thinking, wow, they finally properly show they care, with like a big showcase of like 15 games showing off on stage or whatever. Like a lot of them were low profile, old games and such. But still, Apple showing off games on stage and Game Porting Toolkit, they haven't given up on it. They're making a version 2, not just abandoning version 1.1 in the dust and everything. So I was sitting there all like hyped, thinking that it really showed some interest from them. But I don't know, maybe I am just hopelessly naively optimistic or something.
Yeah, it shows interest. It does show it's in the right direction. It's just not enough. It needs to be 10x of everything. That's what I think.
Yeah, but at the same time, I can't help but think, like, if we roll the clock back 3 years, we got nothing. And then, a year later, we got one thing, and then another thing. And then, like, we've already cranked up the pace quite a bit, I feel. And I'm hoping that, this isn't the final speed, that we're still accelerating. I wouldn't be satisfied if this is just the pace of things and this is top speed. But my hope is that we're still accelerating and things are going to only get faster from here with more and more releases and everything. But I guess only time will tell on that one.
That's true.
Well, I mean, it's I don't feel that different from last year's WWDC, which was very exciting, right? The whole Game Porting Toolkit thing was super exciting. Wow, you could play Cyberpunk 2077 on an Apple Silicon Mac. That's amazing, right? But I feel like it's still like a baby step from there. I mean, AVX support ray tracing, that's great. But what would make the compatibility layer work is a full-on partnerships with Valve, with Proton, a full-on commitment to getting every Windows game working on a Mac, using Apple's might to create an anti-cheat software which is going to work. Epic bought their own anti-cheat, easy anti-cheat, put it in Fortnite. Why not, right? Why couldn't a big corporation do something? They got so much money, right, and resource, they could do anything, right? But I just feel like it's not enough to go in the right direction. It's in the right direction. It's just not enough to make a difference because it's going backwards in a way. If you're not going, the problem with the gaming world is that if you're not going forwards you're getting left behind, like much faster than you're going, making any kind of progress. Right.
Yeah, the rest of the world is moving so fast that if you don't follow, you're just stuck. But also something I think is interesting in the terms of like the trajectory of things is that now we're seeing these Snapdragon X Elite Windows laptops start popping up, which is a big push for ARM laptops on the Windows side. And I wonder if maybe that's going to do some good for gaming on Apple Silicon as well. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, do you want to say anything, Ted?
No. No, it would be nice. I mean, a couple of years back when the Apple Silicon first came out and I was whining about the fact that, Boot Camp was going bye-bye, there was some talk about, I think, what was it? There was an exclusivity thing with
Qualcomm.
With Qualcomm, right, and with Windows, and apparently that contract was going to be over, and then there was some talk, well, maybe there'll be a new Apple Silicon Boot Camp type thing sometime in the future, but again, I don't, that's my hope, but I'm not going to hold my breath because Apple does what Apple wants to do, and they have the power to do it, so. But it would be nice. I would go with it.
Yeah. I mean, the thing, it sounds nice, like Windows 11 ARM making more games compatible. I don't really think it'll make much difference unless they bring it natively, like you said, like a boot camp version. But I think the fundamental issue is that the big misconception about Mac gaming is that it's a technology problem. Like it's so hard to port games to the Mac, right? It's not really a tech problem, okay? And the evidence for this is the fact that there are hundreds, maybe thousands of very profitable iPhone and iPad games, which are turnkey ports to macOS, right? Click a few buttons, do some Q&A. You got a port of Genshin Impact on the Mac, right? And Apple have Hoyoverse, the developers of Genshin Impact, on the stage promoting their iPhone ports, but they just won't turn on the Mac port of that game, even though there are thousands, probably literally hundreds of thousands of people want to play it on a desktop Mac, and they just won't do it. And the reason they won't do it is they don't want to dedicate the resource to maintaining a Mac port, however small that cost would be. And, it doesn't matter what the technology is because that port is like already done. It's the iPhone version works perfectly on a Mac. There's almost no work required. There's no technology to overcome. And there's dozens of games like that which are, have millions of dollars of revenue per day, like PUBG or Warzone or, these mobile titles. And they just won't publish to the Mac even though the port is ready to go, right? So the tech is not the problem. It's not, Windows 11 ARM game ports won't make a difference because even if you had a Mac port ready to go, developers publish they won't invest the tiny amount extra to maintain the Mac port of those games. And it all comes down to the player base. There's not enough players playing on the platform, right? So yeah, that's my thought about Windows 11.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, and I think I've said on the podcast before as well that I think the biggest cost to studios to bring already existing iOS and iPadOS games to the Mac is the support and the QA cost, especially support, because they're going to have people who understand the Finder and the way a Mac works to offer support to customers who have issues on that platform specifically. I don't think it's the development cost, no. It's just about the market share to encourage the final push there and make it worth their while. So I think that's that about sort of covers what I had in mind we could talk about. If any of you want to put some final words in, I'll give you some opportunity there. Otherwise,
well, it's been an interesting chat. I think we covered pretty much everything, all the new developments and the kind of direction. I'd be really interested to see what happens in the next year. I have a feeling it's going to be a repeat of a similar type of thing. Let's see next WWDC what happens. I think it'll be a similar thing. They'll announce 1 or 2 new games, and there'll be a game porting toolkit 3 or some kind of update for it. It'll be iterative. I think the strategy is going to be the same, and I don't think it's going to work the way they want it to. But that's my thought. Yeah.
I don't know. I've got all my fingers and toes crossed for a Pippin release. Good old Pippin. Well, thanks everybody for listening to the show. Do check out Andrew's YouTube channel, and talk to you guys next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.